Welcome, classic rock fans, for another episode of 10 terrible albums by great artists. As always, if you're new to this channel, please be sure to click like, subscribe, and do check that notification bell. And stick around to the end for a few dishonourable mentions. And number 10 in this rogues gallery of albums is Iggy Pop's Zombie Birdhouse from 1982. Ross Horton describes this album as a delicious car crash, all twisted metal and noxious fumes. It seems to be a failed attempt at a dance record. And Rob Dupree comes up with the music on this album, is also responsible for the programming and the music. And I must say the tracks seem like a collection of demos, not very fleshed out, very angular and rattle away from the beginning to the end. In fact, one critic described this as a kind of greasy, sweaty, sleazy rock and roll fitted with a sharp electronic edge. But the problem really is Iggy himself. I think the lyrics are an impressionistic splodge of free association, and the vocals constantly wander off pitch, even out of tune, I'd have to say. Iggy was struggling with quite a few addiction problems at the time, which might explain why this album dived critically and artistically. In fact, it's been described as the result of two drug-damaged, burnt-out rock and roll casualties trying to cook up a set of classics. Number 9 is The Byrds and Bird Maniacs from 1971. I think the Byrds crash and burn in spectacular fashion with this album. The contrast is stark, especially when you compare it to their earlier albums. I think the problem for me is Terry Melcher's post-production, which has all the trappings of Phil Spector's wall of sound. The tracks are drenched in this, or smothered in this largely tasteless orchestra and choir overdubs. Brings me out in a cold sweat. It's the long and winding road all over again. The opening track, Glory Glory, is also disappointing, as the Byrds usually open their albums with quite a strong number. Mr. Tambourine Man, Turn, 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 Fifth Dimension, and of course Ballad of Easy Rider, but we certainly don't get that here. The rest of the album is an eclectic vomit bag of an exploration of different genres, and there's nothing wrong with that in itself, but the songwriting here is incredibly mediocre, and that is even before we get to the aforementioned a syrupy post-production drizzle of overdubs. I think Rolling Stone magazine described this album as increments of pus. The only saving graces are Pale Blue and Kathleen's Song, which are graceful, melodic, folk-inflected numbers written by McGuinn, I believe. And I think these were perhaps rejected songs from the previous album. Number 8 is Bob Dylan's Self-Portrait from 1970. How I've managed to do 2 or 3 of these videos without actually mentioning this one is beyond me. Famously, Rolling Stone opened their review of this album saying, "What is this shit?" Robert Christgau, of course, believes this is a much misunderstood album. Writing for the Village Voice, he says conceptually it's quite brilliant. It's a kind of a meditation on the self and public perception and popularity. I personally think he's reaching a bit there, to be honest with you. Like Blonde on Blonde, this was a double record, but unlike Blonde on Blonde, I think 2/3 of the material on this record was actually written by somebody else. There's even that dreadful cover of Paul Simon's The Boxer. Of course, Simon and Garfunkel had a huge hit with their album Bridge Over Troubled Water that comes out just prior to this one, if I'm not mistaken. In fact, Bob Dylan himself in 1984 said he purposely made this a double album because if you're gonna put crap on it, you might as well load it up. Problem with this album, it just feels tossed off and lazy, and even if the few songs that do lift their heads above the parapet are nowhere near sort of the top tier of his Bobness. I rather like Wigwam, to be honest with you. I find that an interesting number, and we do get the first officially released version of Quinn the Eskimo on here. Bob Dylan later said this album was a bit of a joke. It was supposed to quell all those worshipful labels he'd been saddled with since the beginning of his career. Number 7 is Van Halen 3 from 1998. Van Halen changed singers at this point. They bring Gary Cherone from Extreme. That eventually takes this band to its lowest point in its career, which was a far cry from the heights, of course, this band had enjoyed with the singing chops of Sammy Hagar and the cock-jostling showmanship of David Lee Roth. To cut some slack for Gary Cherone, he's just misplaced, I think. His voice lacks the scrotum to do justice to all the musical pyrotechnics that comes part and parcel of the Van Halen package. And this record did not sell or review well. I think it sold only about 500,000 copies. But his problem isn't just his voice, although he didn't last long in the Van Halen fold before Sammy Hagar came back. But as I said, he's not the only problem. The problem is also that I think the material is rather mediocre and lackluster. Number 6 is Steve Harley and Hobo with a Grin from 1978. This album lacks the glam splendour of those previous Cockney Rebel albums. In fact, Harley himself has dismissed this record as laid-back Californian stuff, saying that he hated it and that it has no guts. All music, of course, has since entered the fray and retrospectively has described this album as an utter desecration of everything which Harley once stood for. It's not all terrible, though. I think Riding the Waves has a smidgen of art house pretension to it. It's quite a nice tribute to Virginia Woolf, even slightly reminiscent of Mr. Soft, I have to say. And Living in Rhapsody is slightly similar to Come Up and See Me, Make Me Smile. But this is Harley's American album. It's a rather flaccid affair, to be honest with you. Described as yacht rock, with lots of disco trappings and God knows what else going on. The production on this is quite crisp, even brittle, I think, to modern ears, very much belying the production tropes of the time. But the material on here is just lifeless. It's a far cry from that best Cockney Rebel stuff. Number 5 is Creedence Clearwater Revival and Mardi Gras from 1972. This band had been whittled down to a trio as Tom Fogerty had already left. And there was a demand from the other two, not including John Fogerty, of course, for a kind of equal songwriting credits, and therein lies the problem. Rolling Stone has described Mardi Gras as the worst album made by a major group, although even Graham Marcussow has described it as an outstanding experiment in rock egalitarianism. Doug Clifford said that John Fogerty deliberately set up this album to break up the band and blow it all apart. And Stu is even more bitter. He goes on to say, never having written or sung at the level of John's previous work, we took the heat. John set me and Doug up to take the blame for breaking up Creedence Clearwater Revival, and then remained silent about it. This album is not a disaster, but it's certainly a mess. There are a couple of decent tunes on here. For example, Fogerty's Sweet Hitchhiker, the country ramble of Looking for a Reason, and there's a wonderful cover of Ricky Nelson's Hello Mary Lou. But I have to say the other songs on this album do not sparkle. In fact, critics have dubbed this record Fogerty's Revenge. John Fogerty in his autobiography said, "It was about as bad as I thought it would be. But remember, I let them do it. It was their idea." Number 4 is Frank Zappa's Thing Fish from 1984. I might get a few howls of disapproval for this, but I think some of his later albums are largely forgettable. The working classes on this album mutated into this potato-headed, duck-mouthed creatures, and the satire of it is not entirely lost on me. I just think it's all poorly executed. There have been accusations of racism aimed at Zappa for this album, but in Zappa's defence, he said he wasn't out to mock African Americans, but merely satirise the way that they are depicted in Broadway, mainly a white male-dominated milieu. The two protagonists on this album, Harry and Rhonda, are two audience members that are drawn into the play by force, it has to be said. Harry realises he is gay, and Rhonda develops a kind of a briefcase fetish. I think a typical Frank-like commentary on the yuppie pandemic at the time. I have to say, I just feel this album is poorly executed, with material from earlier albums just rehashed, and the lyrics replaced with mainly dialogue, I think. Overall, just a poor Zappa album. Number 3 is Lou Reed and Metallica and Lulu from 2011. Good Lord, what were they thinking? I remember the first preview of this album. It was the ill-fated The View, a preview that established from the get-go that Lou Reed's atonal, crotchety sneer just did not fit well with the Metallica's testosterone-fueled fidgety riffage. There are a few interesting ideas that are just stretched out amid this excruciating squall of sound, with many tracks hammering and banging away over the 8-minute mark as Reed and Metallica desperately seek some common ground, only to find there is none. Interestingly, the source material for this album is actually drawn from a series of transgressional plays by Munich playwright Frank Wiederkind, about a stripper who effectively becomes a social climber. We can certainly see the appeal for Lou Reed here as it fits into his urban Berlin-esque, almost voyeuristic quality that his songs often have. But with the gristle and throb of Metallica as his backing band, I think not. Number 2 is The Hard Way by Allman and Cher from 1977. This legendary and thankfully largely unheard album has to make the list. The blue-eyed soul of Allman here is emotes a desire to what, I don't know, and Cher seems subdued on this, which is rather odd for her. The duos are not without merit, but the material is very subpar. There's an interesting version of Jackson Browne's Shadow Dream song, and you'd hardly know Cher was there at all. One can only assume it was an act of, I don't know, artistic or creative desperation. Both Allman and Cher recently divorced, which you thought might yield some interesting results on an album like this, you know, with the tears and strains of the relationship providing some friction and some conflict, but alas not. Instead, it just provides this kind of veneer of what one critic has described as a methadone glazed shell under which one struggles to stay awake. Even Allman's grittiness fails to elevate this record from being just a misjudged yawn fest. And number one is Stephen Stills and the Thoroughfare Cat from 1978. Stephen Stills has described this record as disco swamp rock. I mean, my word, what a winning combination that is. And the music on this LP is not so much an artist operating outside his genre, or even an artist trying to redefine or establish a genre in the case of people like David Bowie or Iggy Pop. This just looks like a case of trying to latch on to contemporary trends and suffers from a serious dose of Saturday Night Fever. We see Stills trying to adapt his music to fit a contemporary idiom. We get the chukka-chukka guitar of the Bee Gees melded with the country twang of Crosby, Stills and Nash. Man, it sounds appealing. You get some pretty awful numbers on this, like Can't Get Me No Booty, What's the Game Lowdown, and a couple of pretty naff covers, Midnight Rider and Not Fade Away. Unfortunately, they can't even save it. There is a constant tearing and fraying on this album as the high-gloss production and guitar-driven rock seems to grate against the desire to be contemporary. This album for Stephen Stills is a bit of a blip for someone who's actually regarded as a pretty decent songwriter. Anyway, what do you think of this list? Please comment down below, and do check out the other videos in this series. I will put the cards up there somewhere. If you've got to this point without switching off, I want to thank you for taking this trip through this rogues gallery of classic rock albums. And as I promised at the beginning of this video, a few dishonourable mentions. On my list is the Smashing Pumpkins and Zeitgeist, an album that's torn apart by internal strife and indecision. The Levellers, Hello Pig, my word, I just never got this one. I've tried to like it, but just cannot get into this at all. Richard Ashcroft's United Nation of Sound sounds like a bit of a send-up of himself, really, on this record. And Limp Bizkit's results may vary, just uninspired mulch. It just leaves me to say I hope you're well, staying safe, more importantly that you keep listening.